Welcome to the Com Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tezangozan. Today is November 18th and we have a packed episode ahead. So in this episode, power plants are burning in the occupied territories, the region is in darkness, and Russian troops are facing problems. Peskov suddenly backtracked. Turns out no one in Russia actually wants to fight NATO at all. Meanwhile, Russia's Belgorod is shutting down schools and hospitals. The sanitary zone Putin dreamed of is now coming to Russia itself. In Poland, a railway is being sabotaged and intelligence services are talking about Russian saboteurs. We'll also discuss what else they might be capable of in Europe, and how Putin has prepared a royal gift for China at the expense of Russians, while Donald Trump is getting ready to finish off the Russian economy, but with one condition. All this and more in today's episode. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So just in one night, the Oriol CHP, the Zuyevskaya TPP, Starobeshevskaya TPP, including the Chaykina substation in Makiivka. This is one of the key energy hubs in the region on the occupied territory where the Russians have settled, are fighting, and were probably planning to launch an offensive this summer, but something didn't work out. A significant part of the occupied territory was left without power, which accordingly complicates logistics, including for the Russian troops. So, Putin thought that he would be able to strike at Ukraine's energy infrastructure unilaterally. No, he was shown that he would not be able to do this unilaterally, and Peskov comes out with a very interesting statement. Lately, there have been some strange statements coming out of Russia, ones that are uncharacteristic for Russian officials. So Peskov comes out with a statement, he's Putin's press secretary, saying that in Russia, there are no supporters of confrontation with NATO. Remind him maybe he doesn't watch Russian television, he should just turn on any of the main propaganda channels. Solovyov, Kizelyov, they've been fighting NATO for 4 years now. They've already defeated everyone there, all the NATO countries. Seriously, they were just recently talking about how a nuclear tsunami from their superweapon would wipe everyone out, and Russia would remain whole and unharmed. So what about all those songs about missiles aimed at Washington? What about that folklore they show right on the country's main stages? What about those Sarmat missiles looking at the United States of America? How come? No one wants to fight NATO. And what about those street polls in Russia? And where are those old communist ladies? All of them, as one, demand a nuclear strike on NATO to wipe it off the face of the earth. At least read what Medvedev writes. He's already defeated everyone in NATO with his wooden saber. And then the main question is, if no one in Russia wants a confrontation with NATO, why did you start the war in Ukraine? You were talking about NATO expansion, biolabs, and so on. If there are no supporters of confrontation, how does NATO expansion bother you? Look, Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and what happened? Nothing. So why did you start the war? For what? If, at the start of the full-scale invasion, Russians living in regions bordering Ukraine had been told the kind of news I'm about to tell you now, they would have thought the person was crazy, that such a thing couldn't be possible. News. The authorities have decided to liquidate, Russian authorities that is, to liquidate kindergartens, schools and hospitals in the border areas of Belgorod region. In all settlements of the Belgorod region bordering Ukraine, which have suffered the most from the war, social institutions are being shut down. The governor announced this. According to him, all these kindergartens, schools, and hospitals that will be closed, their staff will be reassigned somewhere further, deeper into the region, to similar institutions in other settlements. Putin didn't warn about this, did he? And he didn't warn that drones and missiles would fly into Russia, including in retaliation. Remember, at one point Putin was talking about some kind of buffer zone and sanitary zone. That was one of their talking points, which, by the way, they've kind of forgotten about now. You want a buffer zone? Create it deeper inside the territory of the Russian Federation. Close off whatever you want there, schools, I don't know, houses. Measure 50 kilometers deep into Russia. Call it a sanitary zone. I don't know, wrap it in barbed wire. Well, that's how it is. If you want a sanitary zone, go ahead and make one. You're already making it there, on Russian territory. If someone had said in the first days after the full-scale repulsion that in Russia your border regions would be evacuated, schools would be closed, you'd say, why? What's the point? No, we have the Great Army. By the way, about those who are stopping this so-called Great Army, about our heroes, we have an important fundraiser. It's for the 32nd Separate Mechanized Steel Brigade for our artillerymen, a fundraiser for night UAVs, Mavics plus Avengers. Right now, the 32nd Separate Mechanized Brigade is on the Pokrovsky front. That's where, according to Putin, he had already surrounded everyone a month ago. They're really giving those Russian ghouls hell over there. That's why our artillerymen recorded a message for us. Please take a look at it. And the commander of this brigade is also quite remarkable. In fact, she's remarkable. Take a look.
Бажаємо здоров'я! Я командир батареї американських систем М109 Паладин 32-ї окремої механізованої сталевої бригади, яка зараз знаходиться на Покровському напрямку. Ми разом із глядачами каналу Бориса Тізенгаузена збираємо на комплекси Mavic 3T та Mavic 3 Pro та антени з репітерами до них. Ми дуже дякуємо глядачам каналу, які допомагають нам та не забувають, що війна триває. Дякуємо вам. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Let's help our soldiers, our valiant heroes, who right now, at this very moment, are stopping the Russians from advancing further and destroying them. They're simply laying them to rest in Ukrainian soil. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There are options for Mono, Privat, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. If you don't see the links, maybe you're watching on a different channel. There's also a QR code, just in case. In Poland, unknown individuals blew up the railway between Warsaw and Lublin, and the authorities immediately suggested that it was sabotage. There's an interesting detail there. There were 2 explosions, so clearly this didn't just happen by accident. And Reuters, citing its sources in Polish intelligence, reports that it was Russians who blew up the railway. In other words, the Russian Federation's intelligence services are involved. Earlier, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk confirmed that an explosive device went off and that another explosive device was found further along the route to Lublin. This railway is in a region under special attention because this route is used to transport, among other things, military cargo for Ukraine. And now things are getting serious, not just arson attacks on relay cabinets, but something that required more preparation. An explosive device had to be assembled, delivered, picked up somewhere, planted, and set off. In general, in 2 places here it was clearly experienced saboteurs at work. There have been dozens of incidents all over Europe, from attempted arson of warehouses, you probably remember, to surveillance of convoys transporting, among other things, weapons for Ukraine. Remember the packages with incendiary powder, the arson of terminals, the attacks on heads of defense enterprises in Germany? All of these are elements of the large-scale hybrid war waged by the Russian Federation against those countries that continue to support Ukraine. And taking this opportunity, I always want to express my immense gratitude to everyone who supports Ukraine during this difficult time for us. Well, Russia isn't doing all this for no reason. Obviously, the first and main goal is to scare Europe so that Europe stops helping Ukraine, like, look, this could spill over onto your territory too. Today, it's a freight train, but what will it be tomorrow? Today it's a postal terminal that caught fire, but tomorrow it could be the baggage compartment of a civilian airplane. In other words, they're climbing the escalation ladder, and they understand why they're so nervous. We're not even talking about this war right now. Russia is a country that will always be at war. First of all, its foundation now consists of KGB agents, the military, criminals, and oligarchs. On such a foundation, no other kind of leader, except for someone like Putin, can emerge. A Putin will emerge, maybe a little shorter, a little taller, less bald, but it will still be a Putin, and just as aggressive. And the wealth will be distributed among the elites, so the people will need to be told why, despite such natural resources, they live in such poverty. And to explain this, they'll have to invent an external enemy, and of course they'll have to start wars. Basically, everything goes by the manual for them. But now, Russians understand that Ukraine, which is taking shape right now, could be an existential threat to them in the future. In some new future war. So, if you look into the near future, Putin will definitely want to start another war in his lifetime. I've already talked about this. He won't stop on this shameful note of a lost war in Ukraine. He definitely won't go down in history that way. Of course, he'll need some other war, a small one, but one he can definitely win. And now Ukraine is forming a trend toward becoming the weapons hub of the future. That is, based on the contracts being signed now, there's every chance that we will become such a weapons hub. Let's take a look at the recent agreement with France. That is Rafale aircraft, missiles, aerial bombs, air defense systems. By 2035, we are supposed to receive 100 Rafale F-4 aircraft. For Ukraine's combat aviation, SAMP T air defense systems, radars for them, air-to-air class. And in general, air-to-air missiles as well, Now, this SAMP-T is the European equivalent of the Patriot system. It's a long-range multi-purpose air defense system capable of engaging missiles and aircraft. And it seems to have been declared that, in the long term, Ukraine will receive up to 8 batteries of such systems, from France alone. Do you understand what that means? Plus, this year, joint projects between Ukraine and France will begin, including the production of interceptor drones and work on developing critical technologies for our Ukrainian UAVs. In general, in reality, this is a serious 10-year framework agreement on defense. This isn't a one-time delivery. It's a politically formalized long-term partnership between Paris and Kiev. And a long-term contract as well. Contacts, joint developments, large factories that will be built and are being built on the territory of Ukraine. Arms factories. This is the guarantee that Ukraine will become a true innovation hub, producing weapons not only for itself but also for other countries. This will be the key factor that will make the savages from the swamps think 100 times before attacking. I think they definitely won't try it a second time, because the painful gestalt in Ukraine will not be resolved. And I also noticed that we have quite a few long-term agreements like this. Both the US and the UK have launched joint production of interceptor drones with us. Moreover, we're talking specifically about industrial production lines in Ukraine, not just the supply of these drones. With Britain, we are producing our drones together. The Build in Ukraine initiative, that is, a Ministry of Defense program, the localization of international defense companies in Ukraine. In general, the more, the better. The goal is to produce as many systems as possible, from drones to armored vehicles, right here to meet European demand. There are also programs with Scandinavian countries, with the Czech Republic and so on. And there's a very good program with Turkey as well. I won't go into details. In general, this is what Russia is afraid of. That at some point, Ukraine will truly become the country that can help one of its neighbors, whether they're in the alliance or not, if Putin decides to attack again. That's where the existential threat lies for him. If Ukraine, without all the weapons we have now, managed to stop the Russian army, not just stop them, but hit them so hard that they won't soon forget it, then what will Ukraine do to the Russian army with modern weapons? When Ukraine is no longer dependent on the will of our partners, when it's not a matter of, we won't give you Tomahawks, we won't give you this, we won't give you Taurus, and we won't give you that, when Ukraine is no longer dependent on this and has its own weapons, that will be a completely different story, and I believe that we will definitely get there. We have no other choice. You know, every time I hear about Russian weapons again, all these tales about super new weapons with no analogs, Poseidon, Burevestnik, Sarmat. I remember, since we're talking about weapons, that back in 2010 at the Farnborough Air Show, Russia presented a model of its first MC-21 aircraft. They even signed a contract with Malaysia for the supply of 50 of these Russian planes, which they supposedly would produce as an alternative to Boeing and Airbus. The year was 2010. 15 years will pass. The deadlines for serial production of this aircraft will keep getting pushed back and back and back. And this is despite the fact that Russia possesses enormous wealth. Enormous. And already this year, in 2025, at the Dubai Air Show, Russia will once again present a model of its MC-21 aircraft. And you, my dear friends, can't name a single gadget, not a single car, not a single household appliance that people around the world buy from Russia. Can you name me anything like that? Anything at all? Aside from resources and weapons, is there anything at all that Russia knows how to produce? And problems for the whole world? A paper empire with a paper rat at its head. The most interesting thing is that realizing the competition for global leadership is lost. It's over. Russia is no longer in the game. Now it's the US and China competing. And realizing that, as a wise ruler, Putin will not go down in Russian history as someone who multiplied the wealth of the Russian Federation. Yes, just like in the Arab countries. They find oil and that's it. There used to be desert and now there are glass skyscrapers, the tallest towers in the world, artificial islands. Just like in Russia. There's oil, so what? Where are all those artificial islands and everything else? Where is all of that? All those apartments and houses on these artificial islands abroad are being bought with oil money by the Russian elite. So basically, Putin, realizing that he won't go down in history as a wise ruler or someone who achieved any significant accomplishments, understood that the only way to make a name for himself at the end of his career is through war. Now, as far as Ukraine goes, Moldova is just a stone's throw away. We'll see what happens there. As he said, Russia's borders never end anywhere. So Ukraine ended up standing in the way. To what extent, right? For the fourth year, he's trying to take Pokrovsk. For the fourth year, he's trying to capture Donbas. It's the fourth year since the full-scale invasion. No, he's actually been trying to capture Donbas since 2014. Do you realize how many years it's been and how many Russians? How many soldiers he's lost there, these occupiers. By the way, I'm honestly surprised that people talk to Putin as if he's some kind of adult, an equal leader, like Donald Trump, who rolled out the red carpet for him in Anchorage and even sent a strategic bomber overhead so that, the heels of this humanoid would press a little harder into the floor. But he talks to him as an equal, says, I have good conversations with him. Yes, lately he's called him a paper tiger, and there have been some unpleasant moments for Putin, but standing before you is basically an analog. Well, let's say, a slightly larger scale version of Kim Jong-un, who just happens to have more resources. A talentless, greedy, somewhat dim-witted dictator who, in 25 years, has managed to squander absolutely everything possible. The only thing Putin has left is to wave around this rusty nuclear saber. And even here, Europe isn't really impressed anymore, is it? Putin, he's like that old man from the joke who's annoyed everyone. Well, in case anyone doesn't know, or if you're not from the era when people knew what pencils and cassette tapes were for, there used to be these things, so these things were called jokes, and they were supposed to be funny, but now it's all completely different. They've turned into memes and all sorts of other things. So Putin is just like a character from a dark humor joke. Like that old man, when a boy comes to school and his teacher asks, "Why were you absent for 3 days?" He says, "Well, my grandpa died." She says, "How? What happened?" "Well, he was old, 70 years old. We live on the 10th floor. Grandpa came home, was tired, lay down to rest. Then he lit a cigarette, fell asleep, the cigarette dropped, and there was a fire. That's it. The firefighters arrived. Grandpa woke up. They shouted at him to jump, so he jumped out the window." When the teacher says, "So what? He died." "No, he didn't die. He landed right in the center of the canvas, bounced back, and flew right back in through the window." And he says, "Well, then he burned." "No, he didn't burn. He jumped out again and again, landed right in the center of the canvas, and again he bounced off and flew back in through the window." So how did Grandpa die then? Well, they shot him. He just drove everyone crazy. I feel like it's time for the world's firefighters to do their job, and then the whole world will breathe a sigh of relief. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel even despite the dark humor. It helps promote the channel and fight against Russian propaganda. If you want a normal life, Russians, Putin never has money for you. But there's always some for propaganda, so subscribe and let's ruin the mood for the Botox pensioner. And here, Trump has basically already picked up the pen and is ready to sign the sanctions bill, provided he keeps the right to make the final decision on any restrictions outlined in the law. When asked if Trump was ready to support the bill, a White House source said, "He'll sign it. He made that clear last night." Well, Trump wants to have complete control over all these levers, micro adjustments, macro adjustments, like add 10% here, take off 30% there. He wants to keep everything in his own hands. We're basically not against that. But Trump has already taken a step that, as they say, you can't turn back. There's no way to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Sanctions against Russian Gazprom, Rosneft and Lukoil. So that's it, they are forced to sell their assets in Europe. And why did I mention Gazprom by mistake? I came across an interesting piece of news about Russian Gazprom, which Putin has basically bankrupted. Let me remind you, Gazprom is minus 1 trillion. That was their loss last year. The Russian gas monopoly is minus 1 trillion. So here's the news. Gazprom has started designing a new gas pipeline to China for $30 billion. This is the power of Siberia 2, according to the Financial Times. I'm thinking, how did you start designing it? Explain it to me. China hasn't even given you the green light yet to buy additional volumes of gas from Russia, has it? Moreover, you haven't even agreed on the price yet. So there's some kind of framework agreement, and only the Russian side has reported that an agreement was reached. But China says, no, let's wait and see how things turn out. Maybe you'll end up giving it to us below cost. So Russia has already started designing this gas pipeline without having a final agreement on the price, volumes, and so on. I'm thinking, how is that even possible? The thing is, first of all, and this is something Russians will probably especially appreciate, Russia will be building this gas pipeline at its own expense, $30 billion, still not knowing what volumes will be sent to China. That's one. And here's another version. Experts are saying that Gazprom either needs to shut down its project divisions now, or at least give them some work. That's why they said design for the future. Let me remind you the estimate. The design costs can reach up to 10% of the total amount. So of course it's the Russian people who will pay for it, and here is your proof. The State Duma has approved tax cuts for Gazprom after these trillion ruble losses. So Gazprom gets tax breaks while taxes for Russians are increased. I told you in the end it's the people who pay for everything, for Gazprom, for Putin's failed policies, for his entire O0 cooperative, for Miller, for all the rest, for the Kovalchuks, for the Rotenbergs. Russians will pay for everything. By the way, do you remember those Gazprom commercials about how they would freeze all of Europe? Do you remember those ads? Europe is supposedly freezing without gas. But now Gazprom is bankrupt, crawling on its knees, begging Russians to pay taxes for them. There was even a scandal with that commercial when they wanted to show frozen European cities. For some reason, they used footage of the Russian city of Krasnoyarsk as an illustration. And the residents of Krasnoyarsk were outraged at the time. Why are you showing our landscapes as if it's a frozen Europe? Let me remind you, Krasnoyarsk doesn't even have gas heating. Maybe it will appear if Russia builds a pipeline to China through there. Can you imagine? That's how it is. The Chinese blessing will descend. It's amazing. If only they just kept selling gas to Europe at almost twice the price as to China, and not sold it to China at all. They could have kept building their Nord Stream pipelines. Money was flowing in like a river. There were no sanctions at all. Russians could travel wherever they wanted. There was no such thing as Russophobia, or hatred of Russians. But no, the balding jellyfish decided he wanted to go to war in his old age. He'll go down in history as a great loser, and everyone understands that Putin's only achievement in this war will be a scorched piece of Ukrainian land. You see, that's the only achievement, and even that isn't certain. So it turns out all of this was for that. Well, the only achievement that Putin has managed to articulate, at least somewhat, when he was asked directly, so what exactly do we have here, what are we getting out of this? More than 1 million lives lost, sanctions, losses, everything, absolutely everything. And what do we get in return? And I remember how at one event Putin was asked this question, And he answered, giggling like some old pervert. He said, "Well, the Sea of Azov is now an internal Russian sea. Isn't that an achievement too?" Oh, what an achievement. So go ahead and roll it up all around the Sea of Azov then. Build a highway and drive around this ring road. Drive until you turn blue. Drive yourself to death there. That's the achievement. Well, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel. And let's support our glorious artillerymen. The link to donate is in the description of this video. The 32nd Steel Brigade on the Pokrovsk direction. They need our help. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.